color of law, again, is the one that we're going over today. So, y'all know me, Dontez. Glad to be here. And let's get it started with the prayer. Allah, Father of the universe, the Father of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Allah is our protector, our guide, and our salvation, by night and by day. Whose holy prophet, Noble Ali, Shalom Aleichem, Ayah Sha'ayah, Islam, Amen. Peace, 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 peace.
Peace, 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 peace.
Peace, peace. So, if San Francisco, then everywhere. That's the topic of chapter 1 of the book that we're going over today, The Color of Law. And so what we're pretty much going to be getting into with this chapter is what was taking place in the 20th century, like in the early to mid to late 1900s, or really more so the beginning or the early to mid stages of the 1900s. What was going on around America, North America, in the States, around that time, as it relates to public housing and the government getting involved, with the U.S. government and the governments and state governments getting involved with, what they eventually coined public housing. Different programs that they were putting in place for, those who identified as Black and those who identified as white. This is what, they were doing certain things, and certain individuals took advantage of it, and others ran away from others, just based on what was going on around those times. And it happened not only in San Francisco, which is just the topic that we're discussing, but also in other places. I'm in St. Louis, so, like I said, I have a short video towards the end where you can kind of see an example of this, what was taking place back then here in St. Louis. I'm pretty sure, in all of our cities, you can see similar scenarios. Hey. Islam, Noble Ch.1 family. Islam.
She excited to show her fans off.
Islam members. Beautiful.
Oh, that's a nice fez.
That's a nice fez.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
Islam.
Thank you.
Islam.
Continue.
So it was going around in all of our areas, all of our cities. Tonight we'll hear an example from San Francisco, and then we'll see that video on the scenario that occurred here in St. Louis. Just one of many. But if you do have the book, The Color of Law, chapter 1, the title, the author, this title here is just If San Francisco, Then Everywhere. And I'll read some of this here. So, if the federal, state, and local governments explicitly segregated the population into distinct Black neighborhoods in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, it's a reasonable assumption that our government also segregated metropolitan regions elsewhere, and with at least as much determination.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the author, he's interested, and we're interested in, I'm interested in just the government's racial policies in this area in the 20th century. So we'll first just kind of go over this town, Richmond, or we'll speak about the area. Across the Bay Area from the city itself, Richmond, a town with the region's greatest concentration of those who identified as African Americans. During World War II, Richmond hosted the most extensive shipbuilding complex in the nation, Later, it was best known as the site of a large oil refinery. So the author, he met a person named Frank Stevenson in 2013, and after reading an oral history that he recorded for the National Park Service, he just sort of explained what was going on in Richmond. And then now we're just going to hear about an example of someone who he identified a certain way then in the early 20th century, and we're just kind of going to hear his story. This is someone, a black man, someone identified as black. He was a more what he saw and what he experienced back then in the early 20s, as an example. So he was one of 7 brothers. Mr. Stevenson was born in 1924 in Lake Providence, Louisiana, a town that Time magazine called the poorest place in America. But he was privileged compared to most other so-called black youths in the South at the time. His father, a pastor, owned the land on which his First Baptist church sat. So unlike many other Southern black men in the early 20th century, he didn't have to sharecrop for white farmers. The Stevensons grew cotton and corn for sale and raised hogs and fowl, hunted and maintained a vegetable garden for their own sustenance. So, it sounds like Frank Stevenson. So this is an example. We're going to kind of get more into his story, but his family were sort of different in aspects than other people, black people back then. One big difference, though, is that his dad, he was a pastor, and they owned the land where they had a church on. So, a lot of people just didn't have that type of upbringing. They didn't have land. They didn't have, certain opportunities that it sounds like he had. So they grew their own food and they had their own land.
Islam, I'm displaying the book on the screen just for those that want to read along.
Islam. Through this 7th grade, Frank attended a one-room schoolhouse in his father's church, which with a single teacher who lived with the family. If Frank were to continue, he would have had to go to high school in town, which was too far of a walk. In rural Louisiana in the early 1930s, the school year for the African Americans was much shorter than for what they say whites, because children like Frank were expected to hire out when planting or harvesting was to be done. Actually, Mr. Stevenson expected to hire out when planting or harvesting. Actually, Mr. Stevenson recalled they didn't care too much whether you were going to school or not if you were black. So the white schools would be continued, but the black students would have to leave and go work. So during this time, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, first with industry codes and then with Fair Labor Standards Act, prohibited child labor and established minimum wages of about $12 a week in the South, rising to 25 cents an hour in 1938. But to pass such economic legislation, Roosevelt needed the votes of Southern congressmen and senators who agreed to support economic reform only if it excluded industries in which African Americans predominated, like agriculture. The Stevenson brothers were each paid only 50 cents a day to work in white farmers' fields. So, it's just letting us know that, back then, you identify a certain way, you took advantage of certain things, and in some cases, you were at a disadvantage. So they're saying in the 1938s, we know about the New Deal. There are certain things going on. They had that Fair Labor Standards Act where you got paid a certain amount of money to do work. But what they were saying is they were excluding industries in which those who identified as African Americans predominated, like work in the field. So this is just, kind of setting it up for what's to come next once they start getting more into, what was going on with the housing. So After finishing the 7th grade, Frank Stevenson followed his older brothers and found work in New Orleans, delivering food to workers in the shipyards. Later, he had jobs that were typically reserved for African Americans, carrying cement, laying rails, loading or unloading freight, including, and then also after World War II, they were also delivering ammunition. He followed his brother Alan to California, eventually settling at the age of 19 in Richmond, which is the city that we're going to be discussing further tonight. At first, the shipyards and other war industries attempted to operate only with white men, but as the war dragged on, unable to find a sufficient number to meet their military orders, they were forced to hire white women, then black men, and eventually black women as well. And from 1940 to 45, the influx of war workers resulted in Richmond's population exploding from 24,000 to 100,000. So this area, this black area, or area that was populated by the so-called black in Richmond, it soared from 270 to 14,000. Like Frank Stevenson, the typical African-American settling in Richmond had a 7th grade education, which made these migrants an elite. Their educational attainment was greater than that of African-Americans in the southern states they left behind. With such rapid population growth, housing could not be put up quickly enough. So this is when the federal government stepped in and they introduced public housing. So it was officially and explicitly segregated. Located along railroad tracks and close to the shipbuilding areas, federally financed housing for those who identified as African Americans in Richmond was poorly constructed and intended to be temporary. For white defense workers, government housing was built farther inland, closer to white residential areas, and some of it was sturdily constructed and permanent. Because Richmond had been overwhelmingly white before the war, the federal government's decision to segregate public housing and establish segregated living patterns that persist to this day. So when I read that, it, like the author saying, this had to have happened in all of these cities around America. If you're just looking at, if we're looking at certain areas, how did these areas get the way they are? Public housing introduced, a lot of people to, just being segregated, especially when things like white flight took place, which you'll see a lot of in the video that we're showing later. The Richmond Police, as well as the Housing Authority, pressed the city recreation department to forbid integrated activities. So where projects for whites and projects for blacks shared recreational and sports facilities, the authority designated special hours for African American use. The authority maintained separate social programs for whites and blacks, Boys and Girl Scout troops, and movie screenings, for example. A policy of segregation was adopted. Explained the authority's director for the purpose of what he says, keeping social harmony or balance in the whole community. Another housing authority official insisted that the so-called Negroes from the South would rather be by themselves. It's letting us know, in the early 1900s, if you look at, your city, what was taking place in where you're from, your family's from, in the 20s and 30s, based on this information and what we've seen, there's probably a lot of this taking place in your city in the 20s and 30s, in the 20s and 1920s and 1930s and 40s with public housing, communities being introduced to the idea of public housing, introduced by the government to this idea.
Yep, here's on to that.
So if we really just looked into it, then we'll kind of see the storyline in all of these cities. It's not just Richmond, San Francisco Bay Area. If you look into it, you'll probably notice doing research on your own town that a lot of these similar things were happening in the 20s and 30s in your own town.
And it's crazy. Well, I don't think it's ironic that you say public housing basically started in the 1930s, but if you go back like 15 to 20 years prior to that, you will find neighborhoods like the Greenwood District, which is also known as Black Wall Street, you know what I'm saying, before public housing. Then 15, 20 years after that, let us introduce this idea, you know what I'm saying? So that's crazy.
It's long.
Seems strategic even.
Yeah, and it's like it was all happening at the same time, just in different areas. Everybody's city was, similar things were being introduced. So they're saying that was federal, after the New Deal with Roosevelt. They were implementing these things in, all of the cities that, they control. So they were implementing different things and introducing this housing, public housing. And as we continue, it's 20 projects with 24,000 units for both races built in Richmond during this period barely met the need. For white workers, the federal government created a ward guest program in which it leased spare rooms from Richmond's white families so workers could move in as tenants. So the government also issued low-interest loans for white homeowners to remodel and subdivide their residencies. I mean, it's plain. It's right there. It's basically telling us, the federal government, because that was, World War II. So they were having, they called them ward guest programs. So they needed some sort of program, and they established a program, and they were doing this all over. So here in Richmond, they did that, and they were, requiring folks to lease spare rooms for Richmond's white families so the workers could move in their tenants. And then, the government's getting involved in this whole process, which, is sort of the topic of this book. The government also issued low interest loans for white homeowners to remodel and subdivide their residencies. If we're speaking about the government segregating America, how did they do it? What really happened in these areas? What happened to these areas that a lot of us call home back in the day? The government was issuing low interest loans for white homeowners to remodel and subdivide their residencies. So certain areas, they weren't, if you identified a certain way, you weren't able to be involved in certain programs. Consistent with this policy, the federal government recruited one of the nation's leading mass production developers, David Bohonen, to create Rollingwood, a new Richmond suburb. Federal officials approved bank loans to finance construction, requiring that none of the Rollingwood's 700 houses be sold to African Americans, so those who identify as African Americans. This is, just another example of, they literally created an area, and the federal government recruited, a company, and they developed this area, and they called it a suburb in Richmond. And the federal officials approved bank loans to finance construction. So, that's government getting involved to, they approved bank loans to actually build this development. And obviously they're saying that they didn't want, any of these homes, it was 700 of them, to be sold to those who identified as African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dontez, pardon my interruption. I just wanted to quickly share that, this book, as we read it, is kind of an example of how, history is told in the present, from a present perspective. Because, and I point that out because the term African American wasn't even used until 1985.
Come on.
So when in this book he's writing about African Americans, it's because the book was written, after the term was actually used. And at that time, people weren't actually referring to themselves, or even others weren't referring to themselves at that. So I just wanted to just kind of highlight that, when you're reading stuff, if you don't know the history or the etymology of words and how they're used, you read them in the current context, not fully understanding that, the references are made to link things up and not exactly to portray how things were at that time.
Word.
Islam.
That was dope. You're right. Absolutely.
Islam. Gratitude. Noble Barclay. So the government also specifies that each rolling wood property must have an extra bedroom with a separate entrance to accommodate an additional, what they say, white wool worker. Although what he says, African Americans with fewer private options were more dependent on public housing than whites, the Richmond Housing Authority's segregated projects did less to alleviate the housing shortage for those who identified these African Americans than for white families. Not surprisingly, units for African Americans included many doubled up families and illegal sublets. By 1947, when Richmond's black population had increased to 26,000, half still lived in temporary war housing. As the government financed whites to abandon these apartments for permanent homes in suburbs like Rollingwood, vacancies in white projects were made available to African Americans. Gradually, black families became almost the only tenants of Richmond's public housing, except for 3 permanent projects of sturdily constructed units that had been assigned to whites, most of whom didn't want to leave. By 1950, the city's ghetto had expanded, with more than 3/4 of Richmond's black population living in war projects. So, Noble Barclay, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So just what you were saying, earlier, I'm just trying to still digest it. Why would he? So he's saying these words are using these terms. Obviously, it was later, but he's still using these terms to speak about those from back then. Maybe the copper colored races. And you said they didn't, identify themselves using these terms. Well, why would he still be using these terms, you think?
Well, again, I think because it's all written to help the reader. It's all written to help the reader have a clearer, I think, understanding of how melanated people, and make it more relatable to melanated people, right? Like if they, as an example, if they wrote that these were, wars or former wars or stuff like that, the average reader would be like, well, who are these people they talking about? Like it wouldn't make sense, because that's not the vernacular that you're used to hearing. So by speaking in that vernacular, I think it then makes it seem as though, one, that that's the way it always was, and two, that it's easily relatable to, everyone, because everyone understands what those terms are. And it's only those, who have an understanding of history, of etymology, who can, I think, hear those things and piece together and go, okay, I understand what you're saying. But, just like he could have called them copper colored. There's a lot of different things that could have been said, but those things wouldn't necessarily resonate as much because we don't know those names.
Islam. That's dope.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it made perfect sense. It's like history being told in modern terms. You know what I'm saying? It's how can you say, it's basically like telling history, you know what I'm saying, in today's terms, like how you say, if you most people understand the modern, most people don't understand etymology and linguistics. And because, just for instance, right, if you would have said, when you deal with African Americans in modern terms, you know, African American is synonymous to black, you know what I'm saying, so to speak. So when you hear black and you know the only history of black people is really slave history, it make it seem like these projects are for former slaves, right? So that's telling history in a modern term. But if you're telling history in historical terms, right, and you say Moors, it would lead to these people being Moors, and then you know Moors are more sort of like prisoners of war. If you look at the Moors history, people were never really slaves. Moors were always either in noble or illustrious positions, or being forced out of those positions by themselves or others. You know what I'm saying? So if you tell history in historical terms, you have to deal with the historical definitions and all of that. But if you tell history in modern terms, you can spin it in a modern way.
Islam. Islam. Well, when we look at these words, the African Americans and black, as it relates to, you know, what we're reading here, you know, obviously some of us we identify and we understand. How are you looking at these folks from then that they're, you know, he's calling African Americans or blacks? You know, how should we look at what was going on back then? Should we look at it like, you know, like I said, they were possibly taking advantage of certain things, or that been using and going under certain titles when using those things, those names, you know? Because it wasn't just that, it was also, you know, maybe some folks were, you know, didn't bring in a, you know, a bunch of income to be able to afford to live in certain areas, so they took advantage of certain government programs, and they're being listed as African Americans or black. So when we read that now, looking at it then, you know, how are you looking at those individuals back then?
How am I looking at the so-called people who run the government, or the so-called blacks?
The African Americans and blacks. Are we still just, are we viewing it as they possibly were in, you know, poverty scenarios, and they were taking advantage and going under certain titles, taking advantage of certain things to where they consider and list them as African Americans or blacks, were taking advantage of public housing?
Okay, so when you doing the science and you doing the math, right? Like I know what Lamarck said, at a point in time, especially at these times, they didn't start using certain terms until later on, like African American and quote unquote black, till like what, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, so on and so forth. And before then, they were using terms like colored, and colored were short for copper colored. So before then, people of how can you say, the grassroots people were using common terms. They wasn't using all of these linguistic new terms, modern terms that institutions push out. You know what I'm saying? So really, unless we go back into those times or speak to our grandparents, we really don't know exactly what they were saying or exactly where they were coming from. But you, in comparative terms, when you're looking at the dates, like it's 1938, but if you look at 1933, after World War II and all these new deals, a lot of people were poor. You know what I'm saying? Whether you were black or white. That's why in the book it says the projects were made for both races, so to speak.
Both races.
But as the quote unquote government, you know what I'm saying, the people who are in this book are placed, or, you know, they shown in this book as in control, you know what I'm saying, they began to do what? Add programs. You know what I'm saying? Programs that benefited whoever the beneficiaries were supposed to be, you know what I'm saying? Whatever the case may be. But as far as going back into the context of that time, we really have to go, other than the books we are reading, we would have to talk to firsthand or secondhand people who was actually living in that time, or, you know, grandparents, or, you know, stuff like that.
Islam. Well, let's see.
Because you got to,
Islam.
even though you had certain, you know what I'm saying, certain people, quote unquote, came from slavery, you also had sections in towns like Greenwood, the Greenwood district in Tulsa. You also had Rosewood in Florida. You also had you had other quote unquote African American cities, you know what I'm saying, or towns, you know what I'm saying. They was doing good. They wasn't relying on public housing. These are modern ideas, you know what I'm saying. And at this time, this wasn't even an idea to them. So they whole social behavior was completely different then to how it is now. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. We were speaking about by just the 1950s. So by the 1950s, the city's ghetto had expanded with more than 3/4 of Richmond's black population living in what they call war projects. So for the so-called black workers like Frank Stevenson, who couldn't squeeze into the limited number of public housing units, there were no war guests or other supplemental government programs. Mr. Stevenson, like many other so-called African Americans in Richmond who did not get into the segregated public projects, lived in North Richmond, an unincorporated area for which the city provided no services. He boarded with an elderly woman with whom he traded maintenance for rent. Other so-called black workers in North Richmond, not as fortunate as Frank Stevenson, remained in cardboard shacks, barns, tents, and open fields. The so-called black workers who earned steady wages at war industries could save to buy small plots in unincorporated North Richmond, but because the federal government refused to insure bank loans made to the so-called African Americans for housing, standard construction was unaffordable. Some built their own dwellings with orange crates or scrap lumber scoured from the shipyards. By the early 1950s, some 4,000 so-called African Americans in North Richmond were still living in these makeshift homes. And this next part, I think, was really big as well. So the United Services Organization, during the war, the government also collaborated with private groups or companies to segregate Richmond. The United Services Organization maintained separate so-called black and white clubs in Richmond for military personnel, and also operated separate so-called black and white travelers aid services for newly arrived war workers. On one occasion, in 1943, the USO proposed a service center for so-called African Americans on property that was available in the so-called white neighborhoods. The local newspaper, the Richmond Independent, protested a petition drive in opposition to the plan ensued, and the city council prevented the plan from going forward. Although the USO was and is a private organization, it was organized by President Roosevelt, who held the title of Honorable Chairman, benefited from the use of government buildings for some of its clubs, coordinated its services with the War Department, and had a congressional charter. Along the city council's action, this tight federal government nuisance rendered the USO's practice of segregation in Richmond and elsewhere an aspect of de jure segregation. To ensure that no so-called African Americans migrated in Richmond unless they were essential to the war effort, the city's police stopped the so-called African American men on the street and then arrested and jailed them if they couldn't prove they were employed. So after joining his older brother, Alan, in Richmond, Frank Stevenson quickly located a job at a Ford Motor Assembly plant that had been taken over by the government for the manufacture of military jeeps and the refurbishing of damaged tanks. In the 1930s, the Ford plant had a sign in front that stated, "No Mexican or black workers wanted." But when Frank Stevenson arrived in 1944, his services were badly needed. 3 years earlier, the United Auto Workers had forced Henry Ford to the bargaining table, and at the war's end, a union contract prevented Ford Motor from firing the so-called African Americans to make way for the returning white veterans or for white workers who had been laid off from military production in places like the shipyards. So in 1945, when the Army gave up control of the plant and the Ford Motor Company began to make cars again, black workers who had been hired during the war were able to stay on with secure industrial jobs. So there's a lot going on here. I mean, at this point, he's just speaking about the jobs that they were getting back then. I mean, this was World War II. So they had these war industry jobs where they workers of, whatever you said you were, they were all, working and doing pretty much some of the same things. If we skip a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about the FHA, and then we'll wrap that up, and we'll get into that video of a scenario here in St. Louis. The builders, I'm going to go right where they're talking about the Federal Housing Administration. On the following page, the builders went to the Federal Housing Administration for approval of their subdivision plans, and then used these approvals to get banks to issue low-interest loans to finance construction. If the houses conformed to its specifications, the federal government then guaranteed mortgages to qualified buyers without a further property appraisal. Although banks would generally make mortgage loans to affluent buyers without government involvement, they usually would shy away from making loans to working class families unless the mortgages were assured. With reduced risk, banks offered lower interest rates, making ownership more affordable to working class families. The veterans' government approval also usually meant that no down payment was required. As in Roland Woods 10 years earlier, one of the federal government's specifications for mortgages ensured that milquetousness was openly stated prohibitions on sales of the so-called African Americans. And by the way, milquetousness, as we continue reading, is another unincorporated town near Richmond. Because milquetousness had no apartments and houses in the area was off limits to the so-called black workers, though their incomes and economic circumstances were like those of so-called whites on the assembly line. The so-called African Americans at Ford had to choose between giving up their good industrial jobs, moving to apartments in a segregated neighborhood of San Jose, or enduring lengthy commutes between North Richmond and milquetousness. Frank Stevenson bought a van, recruited 8 others to share the cost, and made the drive daily for the next 20 years until he retired. The trip took more than an hour each way. In these areas like Richmond, similar to St. Louis and other areas, they were because of the war industry jobs, and they started public housing. They were able to put all of these restrictions in place, where the government were also going in and putting certain restrictions on loans for certain individuals, so they weren't able to get certain houses in areas closer to where they were having to work. So that was just a part of them, being able to, segregate certain areas. Got you. Segregate certain areas. Islam, no Malik. Milk teaches us. Something like that. Islam. So I wanted to, I thought just hearing about some of this would, kind of get our heads going with, situations that occurred in, our homes, areas that we were in. If you ever, just thought about, why certain areas are how they look now or are what they are now. Some of it within this chapter, if you relate it to your own backyard, was the government getting involved and putting certain restrictions on individuals. And if you did that, you went that way or you went the other way. It just depends. You either were, on the receiving end, a positive way, or receiving end in a not so positive way. There's a lot of areas.
To add to what you're saying, it was called Milpitas. My great-great-grandparents owned a business out in San Francisco.
Islam.
Yeah.
Back then?
Yeah. In the 70s. Yep.
Islam. In the 70s in that area, it was unincorporated. Is it still, do you know if it's still unincorporated today?
I'm not sure.
Gotcha. They called it unincorporated, so they didn't call it a part of that Richmond area or the San Francisco Bay Area. It's an unincorporated, so I guess in those areas, the government, it really didn't have any involvement in those areas. So I don't know if you can consider it as areas where, you were able to, do some things. You just had to do it on your own dime, in your own way, because they weren't, I don't know how regulated those areas were. Yeah. So, yeah, so if we look back, we can all probably state that, in my area, this was happening and this project building got here. And what you'll see in the video that will show now in St. Louis, this was an area in what they like to call it a military experiment. So I'll get that queued up for us. Queued up. Barclay, are you able to make me a co-host? Or can you? Can't see what's on the screen just yet.
Let's see. Oh, no. You need it.
Could you make me co-host? Yeah, could you make me co-host?
Yep, hold on just a second.
Ryan, do you remember that the year off top, that situation that happened in Tulsa?
1916.
1916.
All right, here we go. There you go.
Oh, you know what? I was wrong. I don't know. It was May. I think they started something. They were doing something in 1916, but it was 1920, 1921.
1920, 1921, so the early 1900s. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
It's on. All right. This is an area in St. Louis called community called Pruitt-Igoe. And we'll watch this. It's public housing, which is what we were just reading about. Play that.
Hey, no, Dontez, we can't hear it. So when you share your screen, you got to make sure you check the boxes, share audio, and optimize video. So you have to stop sharing and reshare. And then When you get ready to share it, look at the bot. Look at it. It's gonna be like at the bottom of the screen, and it should click. Should be able to.
Islam.
Yes, sir.
Gratitude, noble.
Islam.
I should be good with it now.
Yep.
Lines in several of the Pruitt-Igoe apartment buildings broke and the subsequent flow of water turned into ice. Today, as temperatures warmed, the ice thawed and residents continued to battle the resultant mess. At 2311 Dixon, the sewer line is broken, and now raw sewage bubbles out of the ground like a malevolent spring. Temperatures dropping as night fall, the residents here at Pruitt-Igoe will probably be frozen in again. And tomorrow, should the temperatures warm up, the water will come back. So it'll go until somebody comes in to remedy the situation.
Pruitt-Igoe. It was a development designed with the mission of being a model for other urban housing projects. As time went on, however, Pruitt-Igoe failed in that mission. It became an embarrassment to St. Louis and a place of suffering to the people who lived there. The residents of Pruitt-Igoe unknowingly and unwillingly participated in a human social experiment as the world watched. And in 20 years, it was all erased as though it never happened. What was Pruitt-Igoe? What caused this historic failure? And what lessons can we take from this experiment gone wrong? In the middle of the 20th century, city planners around the United States started to consider how they would best mold their cities into places where people were more likely to establish businesses, live, and spend their money. Pruitt-Igoe was born out of this concept. Prior to the construction of this complex, the area started as a development known as DeSoto Park. The DeSoto Car development was built in the late 19th century and featured some single-family dwelling units, but many multi-family units that were considered tenements or slums. Many of the residents of DeSoto Car neighborhood were African American, as is the case in most of the slum neighborhoods that made a ring around the city of St. Louis. DeSoto Car, as well as St. Louis itself, had become overcrowded, and city officials knew they had to make room for the residents of the city that needed public housing. By 1908, city leaders were targeting DeSoto Car for reform, citing the lack of services and sanitation in the area. In 1916, restrictive new laws led to the forced segregation of the city, and DeSoto Car became further overcrowded as the cries for redevelopment became louder. By the end of World War II, a city planner named Harlan Bartholomew was responsible for designating a ring of slums around the central business district of St. Louis, which contained DeSoto Car, for redevelopment and a massive slum clearance project. Around this time, St. Louis was beginning to expand their highway system. This really helped set the stage for plans for Pruitt-Igoe in motion. In 1951, ground broke for the new Pruitt-Igoe project, officially known as the Wendell O. Pruitt Homes and William Igoe Apartments, which were bounded by Cass on the north, Carr on the south, 20th on the east, and Jefferson on the west.
Hotel resort, I'd say, it's like just all this newness. I never thought I would live here that time. It's around.
When the plans for Pruitt-Igoe were drawn, magazines met the architecture with critical acclaim and called it a model for the rest of the country. There were 27 hard 100 apartments in the development throughout 33 buildings that were 11 stories each. The price the city paid to develop each unit was equal to the price of a 3-bedroom ranch home at the time. The facilities were modern and many of the residents were proud to live in such a nice place. There were schools, churches, and recreational facilities that were created in and around Pruitt-Igoe. The plans called for Pruitt to be developed for the black residents and Igoe to be for the white residents. But in a short period of time, most of the residents that lived in Pruitt-Igoe were black. buildings began to fall only 4 years later. Pruitt-Igoe was often seen as a dumping ground for people that society did not have any other place for. Not long after the project opened, there was a spike in the crime rate in Pruitt-Igoe and the surrounding neighborhoods. Broken glass and trash scattered outside, elevators that did not work, rodent infestation, and things being thrown from windows. Children had little supervision and were often causing damage to the property. People were drinking in the stairwells. These descriptions of life at Pruitt-Igoe help explain how the city wanted credit for making a grand plan and urban redevelopment, but did not actually want to follow through in ensuring the quality of life of the people living in Pruitt-Igoe was impacted in a positive and meaningful way. The people who were forced to live here had no control over the conditions that existed at the development. Having been a model for other urban renewal projects, the world watched as new methods were tested at Pruitt-Igoe, and these methods were usually met with failure. Financial reform was attempted at Pruitt-Igoe, and this led to budget cuts. Budget cuts led to lack of repairs being made, and lack of repairs led to a rent strike. The people who lived there were forced to live with this cycle, and the rest of the nation watched what worked and what didn't work over and over until the development failed.
Pruitt-Igoe project is now 1/3 down. The rest of it should be left by the end of this year.
Once we're all going to get rid of it, it's been an eyesore and cancer to the city, and we can have this place for the city of Dark.
Along with the social problems of the development, the rent strike added fuel to the fire and financial problems that led to the Department of Housing and Urban Development making the decision to close Pruitt-Igoe in 1972. Remaining tenants of the project were moved to 11 of the original 33 buildings, and in that same year, 3 buildings in the middle of Pruitt-Igoe were demolished. The last 2,000 tenants moved out of the project by May 1974, just 20 years after the first tenant moved in. The final tenant was named Miss Lillian Towns. She lived at Pruitt-Igoe for 18 years and raised 10 children there. She said that the development was beautiful when she moved in, and that leaving hurts real bad. By 1976, the entire development was gone. Pruitt-Igoe lives on. There is much debate and myth that surrounds the question of why Pruitt-Igoe failed. Many people argue that it was the architecture that caused the disadvantages of Pruitt-Igoe. Others say it was lack of maintenance, location, and social problems. Many have argued that the architectural flaws doomed Pruitt-Igoe from the start. The buildings are large and tall, crowded in a complex that could cause a prisoner mentality in the people who had to live there. Initial plans were not followed through that would improve the complex because they were considered too expensive. The failure to improve the architectural problems was central to the demise of the project, and so was the location. Pruitt-Igoe was centered around other public housing areas of St. Louis. Disinvestment and deindustrialization undermined the economic viability of the city's neighborhoods and severely compromised its ability to sustain the delivery of urban services. This type of community disinvestment, coupled with a cold modern architecture that just didn't feel like a home, led to the failure of the project.
Dealing with public housing, the problem that I was just addressing when I talked about affordable housing, I think that simply do not have enough money to operate as well as we should.
Author Elizabeth Birmingham and many others argue that as the project population was increased, money for landscaping and any services such as gyms, playgrounds, a proposed grocery store, or additional public bathrooms disappeared. The only public structure left was a community center where housing authority offices were set up to collect rent and administrate the project. Financial problems at the complex were also blamed by many St. Louis city leaders and many people who have studied the project.
We have our home here, and if the colors move in and our real estate values down, it's bound to create tension. And we'll have, well, I think our atheist experiences becoming equal with the whites. I'm just not an ethnic type, and I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here, one of the main reasons was because it was a white community. And that's the only place I intend to live.
Along with architecture, location, and financial problems, many blame demographic changes in the area, such as the apathy of white residents of St. Louis and a social indifference to the poverty of inner-city blacks. White flight contributed to this, and most of the white residents of Pruitt-Igoe left early and turned their backs on the problem of the project once they were gone. Demographic shifts in the inner city and St. Louis led to the area being considered unsafe, undesirable, and blighted. Planners argue that Pruitt-Igoe yielded pathological environments of crime, fear, poverty, and despair, furthering the perception of blight and fueling the fire of calls for redevelopment and the ultimate failure of the project. The Pruitt-Igoe site has sat empty for decades. Plans have been drawn and failed every time, with the most recent failure coming through the development of a hospital on the site. That plan fell through. Ponce Health Sciences University has announced plans to build a medical school on the site, and has even broken ground. But if history is to repeat itself, there should be doubt over whether these plans will be carried out, or if it will go into the stack of failed development plans of the former Pruitt-Igoe site. For the people who lived at Pruitt-Igoe, the end of the experiment saw them scattered in many directions. Pruitt-Igoe is infamous for its failures, but the people that live there will never know their names, their stories, their experiences at Pruitt-Igoe. They were filled with disrepair, community apathy, and an experiment that I hope is never repeated.
Housing by itself and of itself does not solve all the social problems of our community, and I think that's one lesson that
Pruitt-Igoe was an experiment. It was an experiment that the people that were forced to live there did not give consent to participate in. It was an experiment to solve social ills and to house people. But housing alone does not solve social ills. In the future, we need to listen to the voices of the marginalized people. We need to listen to what will most effectively make their life better. We need to make decisions with them in mind. And that is how we prove.
It's long. That was very informative. I ain't know nothing about none of that.
Me neither.
It's long. It's long. Yeah, that. So yeah, that was an example of a situation here where I'm at, and just doing research. I just recently really kind of dug into that and how like the building was just tore down. They demolished the buildings, and it's 33 towers, 11 floors, levels, and they do call it the pretty much. The first of this kind, I guess. This is when they started doing these high-rise buildings, but I wasn't sure of that. I didn't know if that was something that started in other areas, but they claimed that the Pruitt-Igoe project was, first of its kind. This huge development, and they had all types of people living there, and what the times were back then, you had a lot of folks moving out, and it was public housing, it was government, owned and controlled, and a lot of the maintenance behind the buildings, they weren't maintaining the buildings, and I just think that this is something, when you do the research in our own areas, you'll kind of see, that's usually the case with public housing. A lot of different things aren't maintained, and a lot of different buildings are either demolished or, they're still up and just haven't had any occupants in decades. And then you have certain areas that, they are what they are now, because of a lot of things that were happening in those early 20s. And that's really what, with things like public housing and just government being involved in housing projects and of the sort. Now, them calling it a military experiment, that was something that I gathered later with that. And you may, if you do research on your own areas, you may even see that being the case, where these big military tanks were driving in certain areas and spraying out chemicals and doing a lot of different things in certain areas. And decades later, those areas, what they are now, and that was just a little bit of what I was looking into with public housing. Yeah, I encourage us to kind of look in your own areas, and there's probably going to be patterns, different things similar things that happen in your area that happened in St. Louis, and our example in the reading tonight, Richmond, California. So. Does anyone just know of areas that you grew up in, or is that just the same in all areas? Like this situation in St. Louis with public housing, and maybe the government had certain establishments communities that they built, they were supposed to maintain allegedly, and they didn't maintain it, and certain groups of folks left, and others start coming in, and the maintenance of the buildings got worse and worse. Because they were city-owned or government-owned and controlled. Do we see this in our own areas?
Yeah, most
Absolutely.
definitely, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
I've been a witness to it.
It's just basically a new gentrification. That's all it is.
For sure. Gentrification, and these areas. They look really bad now, but the information is stating in a lot of these areas, if we look at it and match it up, he's saying, if it's in San Francisco, then this probably was the case in all areas. Nobles, that's all I had for you tonight. Do we have any parting comments before we exit?
Man, gratitude for the teaching. That was amazing. I'm saying I learned a lot tonight. And if you get a chance, man, look up what they call the rat utopias. I'm saying where they built they had these rodent projects, and they built these actually mouse utopias or whatever. And they came up with this term called behavioral sync. And it's kind of, I'm saying, it kind of give you an idea of how things are actually kind of like programmed and designed in a certain way. That's why they have the terms like projects, what I'm saying, stuff like that.
Rat utopia?
Mm-hmm. Or mouse utopia.
Well, for Islam, again, nobles, for taking the time and kind of hearing some of this St. Louis history and a little bit of that history that was going on in Richmond, and how they were, implementing these public housing programs in Richmond and other areas, after, World War II, and a lot of policies were put in place, and public housing was pretty much introduced, and it was what it was, and a lot of places closed. A lot of places were demolished, and a lot of areas are what they are now, because of a lot of these programs. And this is government, in a sense, segregating or wanting to divide, groups of people. So definitely do more research on that, and just really uncovering the story that a lot of folks don't know, don't care about, just totally lost and confused and oblivious to it. But if we pay a little attention, I'm pretty sure there's tons of different stories that'll be unfolded, through research and just public housing and what was happening in a lot of the areas that a lot of us would reside in, in our youth. So gratitude in Islam again. I'll end our session tonight with the prayer. And,
hey, no, but real quick, can I ask you to send me that document you read?
The one that we went over tonight.
Yes.
The color of law.
Is it that what color of law?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the color of law.
Oh, okay. Because you sent a part of that, right? In the.
Yeah, that was the cover page.
Okay, got you. Gratitude.
Islam. So, Allah, the Father of the universe, Father of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Allah is our protector, our guide, and our salvation by night and by day. through the Holy Prophet, Noble Drew Ali, Shalom Malakim, Ayah Sha'ayat, Islam, Amen. Peace, 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 peace. Thank everyone and gratitude for your time tonight. Everyone have a great night. All right, brother.
Peace,
Islam,
peace,
Islam.
peace.
Peace.
mypdfbooks.com. That's books with a Z.